we have Cherie Hari Arts here, and she is a researcher for the Iowa State Archaeologist Office. And I'm just going to introduce her that way, and she is going to tell you all about the research and the stuff that they have been doing, which is pretty fun and amazing. So.
Thank you for braving whatever it is that's out there. strange consistency weather. Yeah, I work for the Office of the State Archaeologist. I have kind of two jobs. Technically, I'm called an archaeological technician specialist. And one of my specialties is analyzing the animal bones from archaeological sites, and my other specialty is doing education outreach, preparing programs, materials for teachers, educators of all kinds. So if you have questions about either of those topics, I'm happy to talk to it. Today I'm working on this Iowa Ancient Trails project, which was a partnership between the DOT, the Iowa Department of Transportation, and our office. With the goals. So we all know the square mile grid, the checkerboard of the Midwest. I grew up in Western New York, which is not checkerboarded. And when I first moved to Kansas, I did my graduate work at the University of Kansas. And the first project we had this huge caravan of cars. Everybody drove out to this old farmhouse where we were going to be staying. And everybody hopped in their car and drove back to town. And I'm like, how did they do that? I had just been dutifully following behind the caravan, and everything looked alike. All the crops on all of the corners were exactly the same. There were no landmarks, but everybody knew exactly where they were and how to get back in time. That's because I didn't know about the grid system at the time. My husband, who is a Kansas boy, went to Belize to do archaeology in the jungles. And he grabbed his stuff, and he was the geomorphologist, so he was not working on a site. He was out studying the soils and the landforms, and he started marching across the jungles and the swamps before it dawned on him that he was probably not going to run into a section road and be able to figure out where he was. So there's two different worlds there, the square grid world and the not square grid world. But before Iowa was divided up into a nice tidy square grid, there were lots of other trails there. So we're interested in the archaeology of sites pre-1850. We wanted to identify these trails, preserve what was surviving of them, and then create travel routes for people to be able to go out and see these things as well. So the ancient trails did not follow the grid. They followed whatever route was the easiest. Just like anybody going out in a hike, you're going to go on the high ground, you're going to go around the wetlands, things like that. It also depends on what you're looking for. If you're going out to those wetlands to hunt geese or something, you're going to go straight for them. If you're trying to get from point A to point B without getting too wet, you're going to go around them, things like that. So we discovered that some of these trails still exist. Some of them are field roads, gravel roads, just ruts out in the middle of the prairie. Some of them have been paved and are still modern highways following those original routes. Not all of Iowa is on the grid. So here are the goals. So that's the Transportation Alternatives program from the Iowa DOT. The idea is to get off of I-80 and see some of Iowa. There's a lot to see here instead of just going straight through at 75 miles an hour. So we wanted to identify the surviving remnants, see what we could do to preserve them and appreciate them, and then developed those tours. And unfortunately, it's slopping off the bottom. But if you do a Google search of Iowa's Ancient Trails tours, you can download these tours. There are 8 of them. And they'll give you the driving directions. They'll give you highlights of what you might be seeing along the way. So, okay, why only the northern counties? This project was targeted the northern tier of 42 counties in Iowa. Partially because this region has a wide range of historic trail types. We have military trails, we have Native American trails, mining trails around Dubuque. So some of these are really old. The original fur traders traveled through northern Iowa. We have 7 of the 12 Iowa landforms you will cross going from east to west across northern Iowa. So there's a lot of very dramatic stuff from the Paleozoic plateau, which is, Bill says, almost mountainous. Bill's been in Iowa for a long time. But there is a lot of exposed bedrock, which is something we don't have in southeast Iowa. I always have bedrock envy when I get up here. Oh, look, cliffs and caves and things. Then the Des Moines Lobe, which was the last glacial feature here, and then on west into some of the earlier glacial features. We also have a good example of trail preservation. This part of the state has not been as developed as the southern part of the state. So we have some good trail preservation. And then finally, the GLO surveys, we rely a lot on their maps. When they were doing, these are the guys that made that square mile grid. When they were doing their survey, the southern part of Iowa was already beginning to be settled. And there had been agriculture and things like that. The GLO surveyors recorded everything. The plant life, the Indian villages, old trails, and things like that. And it was more likely to be what pre-settler things looked like in the northern part than in the southern part. So that's interesting to us as archaeologists. Our resources, the information that we had, some of the earlier explorers from the 1700s and the 1800s did make maps. They had to communicate with one another. They were business people. They were here to do fur trade, especially fur trade, also lead mining and things like that. So they made maps of the region. And they're funny looking maps because they did not have all of the tools for map making that we had. Mostly they had a compass. And so I can tell you a little bit more about that. Military maps. Military is nothing if they're not organized, but they had to get supplies to places like Fort Atkinson, Fort Madison, and points west, so that there are military trails for those supply roads. Native American people, we actually have the 1837 Iowa map that was made by a delegation of Iowa Indians and it outlines their movements. It's a historical map, so they have oral tradition. They relate their history orally. So as he told the story of their history in the area, he drew the map. So this actually goes back in time as well. And then finally, we have the U.S. General Land Office, who surveyed between 1833 and 1861 and developed the maps here. So these are the primary resources that we used for developing this program. Here's sort of a family tree of the maps. The earliest ones we have are 1702. Often the maps are copied one off of another or related to each other. You can see here what the researchers have done. The yellow area shaded in is approximately what's Iowa. As you can see, some of the maps are a little strange looking. They all knew that the Missouri runs sort of south, from north to southeast. They did not get every bend and nick into it, but they did mark where different rivers intersected it. So by using those land points, you can establish the grid. Just for a few examples, this is the 1718 map, the Chemin des Voyageurs, the Path of the Voyageurs. These were the fur traders. They were really interested in contacting Native American villages. They also were really interested in traveling by water whenever they could, because when you've got hundreds of pounds of furs, it's a lot easier to put them in a canoe than it is. So they wanted to connect to the Great Lakes via Wisconsin. They had those huge, enormous canoes that they actually took across Lake Superior, 16 men paddling them. So you can see here we have the Wisconsin River, the Ouisconsin River, hits the Mississippi, and then the Trail of the Voyageurs extends right straight across, crossing the Des Moines River to the Spirit Lake area here. And they identify I love the spellings. This is the Aiaouez, the Ioways Indians.
So were those lakes the smaller ones, the lakes?
These are just the whole Spirit Lake area. They didn't, again, they show them on it's just like little circles. They didn't try to make them the right shapes and sizes and things like that. And then the trail goes on from this region over to the Missouri area, where again we have more Ioways and the Omaha, the Maha. Here is another map. This one is from 1719. Again, we have here the path of the voyageurs. We see it on here. They map on it also. Lead. We talk about fur trade in most of the West, but lead mining, lead trade was really important economically in Iowa. Lead went into all that ammunition. Lead went into pewter. It was a key resource. And when the Meskwaki lead mines up here around Dubuque get shown on these maps as well. So on this map, we have a new trail added. This one that is running from, this is the Rock River, up to Dubuque here, and then we've got the Wisconsin and on across. Only this time we see the Trail of the Voyageurs going all the way out the Missouri, out a little farther out. Please come in. We're casual. If you have questions and things, please be my guest to answer. And there's one more little trail that shows up on this one. Somebody discovered cleverly that if you went a little bit north, you could take what they called the river, the Kickapoo River, which is the upper Iowa for us. You could paddle out here, and then you had a much shorter portage over to the Des Moines, and then on across. 1776 now, we're in English map, the Great Meadows. I love that description for the Great Plains. But again, you can see the yellow shaded area showing you approximately what's Iowa. You have to make those little mental adjustments. And this one shows us a trail coming from where the Des Moines joins the Mississippi. This is the river of the Moynihinga. The Moynihinga were a branch of the Illini Indians. The French first encountered them along this big river, and they named it the River of Des Moines-Hinga, or the River of the Des Moines. So this one is essentially from Keokuk north to, here's the Rock River. So this is the Quad Cities area here. And then we still have the what they label as the French route to the Indians. Again, going all the way out there. So it was a jigsaw puzzle of assembling these maps, slightly different versions. Everybody has kind of a different version of this map, but they all end out crossing the Des Moines at the same area, and then coming into the Spirit Lake area, and then heading on west for various reasons. And now, as an archaeologist, especially someone who's interested in Native American history and prehistory, the identification of these villages is fascinating to me. So here we have the Iowa villages shown on the map, and these are, of course, their business partners. These are the Oto and the Omaha, and the Kanza are on here. So we're beginning to get an idea of what some of the very early historic distribution of the Native Americans were.
Where would Blood Run be on?
Blood Run is right, it's up here where these big villages are right here. We'll be able to see it when we get on a better adjusted map. My favorite, this is the 1837 Iowa map. So-called, sometimes it's called the No Heart map, because this man's name was No Heart of Fear. He was the Iowa leader of a delegation to the powers that be in Washington, D.C. This was at a time period when the federal government was telling all Native Americans, move west of the Mississippi and we'll leave you alone. We're going to take all this territory. You guys go over there. The Iowa were like, hello, we're over here. There are already people here. Thank you. So they were getting crowded as more people were getting pushed into their territory. And they made this delegation in an effort to show that they had a historic precedence in this area. Remember that they did not have a writing culture. Their culture related their history and their stories all orally. This guy picked up pen and pencil and drew this map showing, as again I said, he told the story of the Iowa in Iowa. So all of these villages and things that he shows were not occupied at the same time, but we were here and then we moved here and things like that. But if you start to look at it closely, first you have to tilt it, because he did not have the tradition that we have of north at the top of the page. And then you can begin to identify the Wisconsin River, the Mississippi, the Missouri, and then you start to know all of these little rivers that fit in here. Here's the Des Moines. The circles with dots in them are villages. The open circles are lakes. So this is probably the Spirit Lake area around here again. Some of these villages we can recognize. We know these sites. Here on the Des Moines River, there's a large village down here called the Iowa Village, the Iowa Village. It was the last large village that the Iowa occupied before they were removed out of the state. There's been archaeological work done there. We know these villages. So some of this stuff can be correlated to what we know archaeologically as sites and things. And of course, he's showing all their travel routes and trails on here as well, which ka-ching for this project. You can use GIS, Geographic Information Systems. You can begin to locate things like, okay, here's where the Platte and the Missouri join. We know that's Omaha. Here's this big chain of lakes at Madison. Here's where the Mississippi and the Missouri come together. That's St. Louis. And now you can adjust it to a modern map. And you realize that this guy drew from memory 300,000 square miles of territory. Can you draw a map of that area? Showing all of our roads and transportation routes and the cities and towns along the way, just like he did. It's really a phenomenal map. And you can look up, if you look up the Iowa map on our website, you can read a lot of information about it. So it's the only non-European, non-American map of Iowa. No heart lines represent things that can be correlated with archaeological sites, and it shows a sequence through time. This cool thing here is a black walnut dugout canoe that was dug out of the banks of the Des Moines River and donated to the Meskwaki Tribal Museum at the settlement in Tama County. You can go and visit it. It's probably a historic. Even black walnut won't survive buried in the riverbanks for too many hundreds of years. But it's kind of a cool evidence of how somebody might construct a dugout canoe. The GLO boys, they mapped more than 6,000 square miles of Iowa in the northern 42 counties alone. They showed everything. They showed the Native American villages. They showed the Native American fields, their farm fields. These people were intensive corn farmers. They showed the early settlement sites from Euro-American settlers. They showed networks of trails, and they recorded what the plant life was like. This is the best documentation. Iowa is the most changed state of the Union. They figure 1% of the state of Iowa is anything like it was pre-contact. 99% of the prairies are gone. 95% of the wetlands have been drained. More than 50% of the woodlands and forests are gone. So these maps are valuable documentation of what Iowa used to look like. And as I say, in the northern part, it was less changed at the time that the GLO maps were being done. They also kept extensive notebooks where they recorded what they were seeing and what they were doing. So this is just a shot of one of their maps showing the military supply road between Fort Crawford and Fort Atkinson. And it's tied to the square mile grid, which gives us an opportunity to be able to find these points where it crosses various things on the grid and to be able to relocate this trail. There they are. Fort Atkinson was in what was called the neutral ground. They moved the Ho-Chunk, also known as the Winnebago, out of Wisconsin and into the neutral ground, strategically placing them between two traditional enemies, the Lakota and the Meskwaki. This did not make the Ho-Chunk real happy. So they established Fort Atkinson here. Ostensibly, it was going to protect the Ho-Chunk from the Dakota and the Meskwaki. It was also, they set up the Winnebago Agency. This is where they could come to get their supplies, their monthly allotments of food. So they were hoping that all this would force them to stay in this region called the neutral ground. They wanted to go home. This was where their sacred lands were. This was where their traditional homeland was, and they kept sneaking back. So besides protecting them, Fort Atkinson was here to kind of keep them in the neutral ground area. It was one of the most peaceful forts. I don't think a shot was ever fired in anger at Fort Atkinson.
Where is Fort Atkinson?
It's in the town of Fort Atkinson in Winneshiek County in northeastern Iowa. There's a lot of the fort still there. A lot of the fort was, after they abandoned the fort, the troops were shipped out to the Mexican-American War. And then the people of the town came and borrowed a lot of that fine cut stone. And so much of the buildings in Fort Atkinson, you go and you see all these beautiful stone houses. They're all made from stone from the fort. But part of the original barracks is still there. Archaeological work was done there and exposed the foundations, and we created a walking tour so you can go up and follow the map around and know what foundations you're looking at, and it's got some information of the history there. So it's a really interesting place to visit. The first weekend in September, I think, every year they have a big rendezvous where lots of people who like to do reenactment gather there. A lot of fun. More military roads. This military road from Dubuque to Missouri, and they were instructed to do it through as many county seats as possible. So it goes through Dubuque, Jones, Lynn, Johnson, Washington, Henry, Van Buren counties, crossing through known locations, Washington, Iowa, Iowa City, Dubuque. So again, we can identify it. Then we also have Agency City. This was another Indian agency where people were getting the supplies, were being distributed to the Native American tribes. So we also now have a trail that shows going from Agency City to Burlington. Here's another trail. This one doesn't give us a lot of detail on either side of it, but this was another military trail that went through Jones County. There's an archaeological site here called Bowen's Prairie. The town, it was bypassed by the railroad, so it vanished, but it's an early historic settlement town in Iowa. So how do we figure all this out from looking at it? We use GIS to squeeze these maps into our modern understanding of the geography. We can do that using topographic maps, aerial photographs, and the wonder of wonders, LiDAR. Take a quick look at some of them. The topographic maps are all based on aerial photography. They flew over them, drew the maps, put in the contour line, so they have 5 or 10 foot contour intervals on them so you can see the geography on it. And now we can look in the GLO map. We have a trail that crosses this section line and hits that section line and ran approximately northeast. But if you read their notes, it says that it ran along the river bluffs. So we can look here and say, okay, here are those 2 section lines, our points on the grid, but here is the bluff line. So this is where they drew it, but this is probably where the trail ran. It still hits those points on the grid. So this is what the researchers were doing when they created this project. We also still have these aerial photographs. These are all scanned in digitally. So it was flown 4 different times in the 30s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. These things are, again, fascinating. If you want to find something that was along, this is the Cedar River. Look where the Cedar River has been in the past few years. If you want to find something that was going alongside the Cedar River, you have to know where the Cedar River was at the time. And you have to be able to look at all of these things and see all these abandoned oxbows and old meanders and things like that. So this is really valuable information. These are really fun to watch. You go through time, you watch the sizes of the farms change and things like that. And then finally, LIDAR. LIDAR stands for Light Detection and Ranging. It's done with aircraft. It's kind of like sonar, where they fire little light beams, laser beams, down on the ground. These things bounce off of the surfaces and are to a collector on the airplane, which is collecting them along with the GPS coordinates of them. And then you can sit down with your specialized software, and you can remove all the light beams that bounced off the trees and remove all the light beams that bounced off the grass until you get just down to the ground surface. And so what you end up with is this thing that looks like a moonscape. The plants are all out of the way. The houses are all out of the way. You see the funny little flat areas where there used to be an thing. But ruts of old trails, earth lodges, burial mounds, jump right off the map. We can find lots of sites just sitting at our desks looking at the LIDAR scans. So then taking some of the old maps saying that there must be a trail in this area, then we can go to the LIDAR and say, oh, look, there it is. And then, of course, we also had one thing Bill Whitaker loves to do is dig through all the old newspaper articles, people's diaries, journals, letters. Every time they find references to things like an old Indian trail, they would try and figure out where these people were talking about and see if they could correlate that with some trails that we know or locate geographically. And then you have to do what we call ground truthing. You've found all this stuff on your maps sitting at your desk, and now you have to put on your boots and go out there and look and see. And sure enough, those trail remnants, so this is an old wagon ruts going right through a pasture in Dickinson County. So this is one of those surviving trail remnants. So what we come up with is 1,090 kilometers of trail remnants were identified. Many of them are in private fields, but others are public roads. Look at Dubuque over here. Look at up there around Fort Atkinson. All those trails show up here. And using this information, then they developed the 8 tours that you can download and go visit some of these places. So I'm going to talk specially today about tour number 7, since we're in the area. This one runs from Spirit Lake to Blood Run. One of my favorite spots. So we're going to start out. These are those geographic landforms I was telling you about. And so we're going to be especially looking at the Northwest Iowa Plains and the Des Moines Lobe, although Western Iowa also, you can't leave out the Luss Hills. But we're in the upper part here. So we're going to go across the Des Moines Lobe and the Northwest Iowa Plains. Des Moines Lobe is a unique feature. It is the last gasp of the Ice Age into Iowa. the Ice Age was pretty much over, except this one glacier just had to make one more stab at getting Iowa. The Ice Age started about 2.6 million years ago, and so there were numerous advances of glaciers. Iowa was completely covered a number of times. This is at the very tail end of it, just one more chance to get Iowa. And it came bulldozing down into the state in a last gasp. Bulldozers move like, or glaciers move like bulldozers. As they slide across the landscape, they push debris in front of them. Rocks, trees. They're over by Mitchellville. There's like a whole spruce forest that was flattened by the glaciers. Nothing stops them. We're talking masses of mile-thick sheets of ice. But the terminal moraine of this last grasp, this rock that they push in front of them, is called a moraine. And we talk about glaciers retreating, but they didn't back up. They just melted. And they leave this moraines like a bathtub ring where they've been. So the terminal moraine of the last glacier to enter the state is where the state capitol is built in Des Moines. It's up on that high ground there. That was left behind by the glacier. So as it retreated, so this landscape in the Des Moines lobe is a baby landscape. This ice retreated about 10,000 years ago, which is nothing in geological time. So it's a very young landscape. The drainage is poorly developed. The rivers just haven't had a chance to do any down cutting. It hasn't been here very long. So it's very flat. It's peppered with lots of interconnected wetlands. You will still find, I'm sure if any of you farm in this area, you're really familiar with all the big boulders that the glaciers dragged in. You see them all piled in the corners of the fields. But so here's an aerial view classic view of the Des Moines lobe landscape. But then as you go west, you cross off the Des Moines, you go over that land. You should travel with my husband sometime. It gives you a narration. We're now going up and over the terminal moraine. He's a geomorphologist. He's into the, but this northwest Iowa plains was glaciated more than 20 to 30,000 years ago. So this landscape has been ice-free for much longer and has a chance to develop these well-developed drainages. So you start to get these more rolling hills, older, more deeply developed soils. So the landscape changes noticeably, and really even without driving around with Joe, if you start paying attention as you drive across, you'll recognize the changes in the landscape. Don't let people just tell you, oh, Iowa is flat. Yeah, it's really got a very interesting geographic history. And then finally we have the Loess Hills. This is the one of two extensive land developments of Loess. The other one is in China. These long, steep bluffs that extend in an unbroken line from Sioux City south to Missouri. It's one of the only places in the world where you can find such an extensive deposit of loess. So another unique landform that we have here. So as you head out across this trail, we'll start here at the Iowa's villages that were identified by the French right around Lake Okoboji. There has really been very little archaeological work done around here. It's quite developed because of a tourist area. John Dorshuk, who is the state archaeologist, has been conducting some field schools in this area, and they have excavated some Oneota sites, late prehistoric sites, and some woodland period sites in the area. As far as we know, we haven't been able to identify this particular location of this village. And as you drive west, you'll pass Ocheeden Mound, which is just a landmark. It's not an Indian mound of anything. But you're driving along the path of the voyageurs now. What people don't realize that they're missing when they don't get off Highway 20 or Highway. So you can pass Silver Lake, Rush Lake. It's a really lovely area. And as you cross right here, there's the magic line where at Sibley, you're leaving the Des Moines Lobe and crossing onto the northwest Iowa Plateau. And there's some cool stuff here. As I say, the glaciers did cover this part. In the northwest corner of Iowa in Lyon County, this is the only place that you have Sioux quartzite exposed in the state of Iowa. Now, if you go 5 miles in either direction into Minnesota or South Dakota, it's everywhere. But it just peaks out in this corner of Iowa. Sioux quartzite is the oldest bedrock exposed in Iowa. This is part of the main, what they call the craton of North America. It's 7 on a hardness scale of 1 to 10. Oh, it's really hard stuff, but if you get out here at Gitche Manitou, you can see places where the glaciers planed off, and actually kind of hard to see in the picture. Can you see all the vertical stripes? That's the glacier dragging rocks across this very hard rock and actually gouging the rock out. And it's really pretty. Also at Gitche Manitou are several prehistoric Indian burial mounds. You're invited to visit respectfully, recognizing that all human burials in the state of Iowa are protected by law. Proudly to say that we were the first state to do this. We were 10 years ahead of the the NAGPRA federal rulings. But you can see the lovely locations where these mounds are protected. And then you can go on to Blood Run. Blood Run is a National Historic Landmark. Just a most amazing site. Lynn Alex maintains it's every bit as important as Cahokia down by St. Louis. It's an amazing site. So it has some of the features it has are these pitted boulders. Its surface looks like a golf ball. People did that. People pecked these dimples in these big boulders. It's a glacial rock that was left behind by the glacier, but the holes are pecked out of it. There are 7 or 8 of these glacial boulders have been identified at Blood Run now. No idea what it was all about. We've had several, lots of people like to throw out ideas. People have suggested that that they were getting rock for making raw materials, that maybe they were somehow using it to sharpen tools. I had a kid once, when I was doing this presentation, and a 6th grader suggested, he said, well, maybe it wasn't, maybe they just wanted a little piece of home, so you chipped out a little bit of rock and you put it in your pocket and took it with you, so you had a little piece of home with you. As good a shot as anybody else has made. I rather kind of like it. Also, these people were intensive corn farmers, so we find these huge, deep storage pits there, and burial mounds. This was a city. The early explorers, some of the early settlers at the site, I say there was a farmer who drew a sketch map here when they first arrived here. He identified 276 mounds, one of which he's described as being sinuous like a snake. It might have been a snake-shaped effigy. It might also have been some sort of a fortification thing. Boulder outlines where the rocks are arranged in circles around the foundation of a house or a teepee, or there are farther west on the plains you find rocks arranged on the plains in the shapes of turtles and areas as a kind of artwork. And then the pitted boulders. You can still see some of these houses we were talking earlier about the gravel pits. You can see here they were mining sand and gravel. This is another sand and gravel pit. But we have a few survivors here. Look at all the burial mounds. Up here, see, I think I've circled them all. So these have not been plowed badly. They really show up. This is the wonder of LIDAR. This is the LIDAR map of the site. These have been plowed here, but you can still see them. LIDAR is wonderful stuff. So these are the surviving remnants. The state is in the process of trying to acquire the land that Blood Run is on. So this is We know it was occupied. The oldest materials from it are about 6,500 years old. That's prehistoric, pre-contact, before written records. Probably reached its zenith as a trading center in the 1500s and 1600s. There are historic living Native American tribes, the Iowa, Oto, Arikara, Cheyenne, and Dakota, all have oral traditions about visiting this site and trading here. We find artifacts associated with those things. We find European trade goods. These trade goods got here way before the Europeans. So somebody back east is trading for material. Maybe they got a flintlock gun or something like that. And then this stuff gets traded farther and farther west, just from hand to hand between the different Indian tribes. So this stuff got to Blood Run way before the Europeans did. So this is an artist's conception of what it might have looked like. Here's that high-rise place that we saw right in the middle. Houses scattered all over the place. What they were doing here, it's a site of giant artifacts and little tiny artifacts. Look at the scales. These are the arrowheads. This whole thing is 5 centimeters. Those are little tiny arrowheads. These are drills. Again, this is 5 centimeters, so they're just a couple of centimeters long. They were probably used because we also find all kinds of stuff made out of pipestone. It's only maybe 30 miles from the pipestone quarries, which are just north of the state line here. These people were traveling to Pipestone. They were quarrying the rock, bringing it back to Blood Run, and making it into things. We find, this is the debris, the manufacturing debris. So when you cut something off, then you throw that away and keep the good stuff. These drills were probably what was used for hollowing out the pipes and the pipe stem holes and things like that. So these tiny little things. These are abraders. It's just made out of sandstone. Sandstone works just like sandpaper for shaping bone, for shaping rock. We found there's a pendant there made out of pipestone. But then you also find at this site these huge smashing mauls for bashing up bison bones. And you find lots of this very typical Oneota strap-handled pottery here. Blood Run is a really cool place. This is something else you find at Blood Run made out of pipestone. It's got pictures incised on it. All you mostly see from here is scratches. But if we outline them, we see lots of pictures, and we see them, they're all stacked on top of each other. Whatever the purpose for making these, it apparently didn't matter what it looked like in the end. It was probably the process. And if you think about the Dene, the Navajo, when they do sand paintings, in many of their religious ceremonies and their healing ceremonies, the person doing the sing will make a very elaborate piece of artwork on the floor of a hogan with colored rock and colored sand. And it's part of the process of the sing. It sometimes takes 2 or 3 days to do these. And they're gorgeous paintings, and it's completely unstable. When the ceremony is over, it's swept up and gone. It's the process that was important. And I suspect that maybe this is what we have here. But here's some of the pictures that we have on here. Water monsters. These are mythical creatures from many of the Oneota, and the descendants of the Oneota have oral traditions. Like we might talk about dragons and unicorns. They talk about water monsters. We've got some sort of a large bird here who has something small and round in his mouth. He might be carrying the world in his mouth for all we know. This thing, whatever it is, I don't know, shooting star, comet. There's a bison. She's easy. This is the lifeline. I say she because probably she's pregnant. That's in the illustration. Why would you bother to show that part if it wasn't? And then one more bird, there he is. And this one is clearly some sort of a raptor. He's got the hooked beak. He's cool. It might be a thunderbird. It might be a mythological as well. But here they all are stacked up on this single tablet. And there's several of these tablets have been found at Blood Run. So in South Dakota, it's a state park called Good Earth State Park at Blood Run. The Department of Natural Resources of Iowa is trying to develop the Iowa side also into a companion park. There is a self-guided walking tour from the State Historical Society. If you're interested in going there, you go to iowaculture.gov, Blood Run National Historic Landmark, and you can download the walking tour and go on a hike. It's a very cool place. The state is trying to jump through the hoops of acquiring the land. We're working very closely with the Native American descendants of the people who are associated with the site, so that their sacred sites are protected and secure and interpreted in a way that satisfies them. So if you're interested in touring more archaeological sites, our office put out this book a year or two ago now, Archaeological Guide to Iowa. Part of the problem with visiting archaeological sites is that most of them look like soybean fields. People are saying, show us the sites, and well, see that cornfield over there? That used to be a woodland village. Use your imagination. Because we don't have, architecture and things like that like you might find in Europe. We do have burial mounds. We sometimes have earthworks. And where those have been preserved, and they are in parks or state preserves or things like that, you can go and visit them. And this book will be a guide. Also, if you go past some of those tours on these routes, they'll be identified on those routes that if you can go and visit them. Or a museum or a visitor center where there might be artifacts from a site that looks like a cornfield, but you can see the artifacts that have come from it. So I say get out there, go do it. You can get the book or you can just download the tours. There's lots of things to see. It's a fascinating state. I'm open to questions. Anybody has anything else that they'd like to ask about or we could talk about in more detail?
I'm curious with the LiDAR. Is that something you just work on, or will those be released at some point?
The entire state has been flown with LiDAR. You can get access to it. I know that state and county governments use it for different things. I mean, they can tell if you have a swimming pool in your backyard or a trampoline, and whether or not they should give your taxes for for that swimming pool or not. Also, lots of uses for planning roads and rivers and things like that. So they're often available from the state. Yeah, those are your tax dollars at work, so you should be able to get access. You can also access all those GLO maps have been scanned and are available digitally as well. Yeah.
How long has LiDAR been around?
Maybe 10 years or so. Yeah, it was, as I guess they first started using it for military uses. And one of the women working in our office was working on her master's degree, and she kept saying, I'm taking a class, Spy 1 and Spy 2. But she was one of the people who first started developing the software that would allow us to pick out burial mounds and things like that. They hadn't really realized all of the other applications you could have. And as you say, you probably heard just recently, within the last few months, they have flown the jungles in South America, and the Mayan archaeologists are just flipping out. There are highways and cities and things like that that are completely buried in the jungle. They said prior to that, they had to go, take your machete and go out and see if you could find a site, hacking your way through it. Well, now looking at the LiDAR, they know right where to go, and they can go and actually start doing research rather than spending their time hunting for sites. Yeah, it's a fairly recent thing, 21st century.
You mentioned that only 1% of Iowa is still the same with the wetlands and stuff that it used to be. Mm-hmm. Why is it not in the other states? Because they're more populated and they've already torn it up and you can't find it, or?
No, we've rearranged more of our state than anybody else has, any other state in the union. Mostly because we have rearranged things for agriculture. Draining the wetlands and things like that was all done for farming purposes. Also clearing the woodlands. You'd think something like California or New York, where they have huge cities and populations, and there's all kinds of change that has been done in those states, but Iowa is designated officially as the most changed state.
How much work have they done trying to find that Iowa village that was the Iowa
We know exactly where that is. The one of Lake Okoboji. I think people have looked. I think it's been so developed, so it might be under a motel or something. It's, they are doing survey work around the edges. I think that specific location has never been identified, has probably been disturbed.
And they think they found it, what will they find?
They will find artifacts that are from the right time period. We know from finding other Iowa sites from that time period, what kinds of materials they would have had there, and they would find those kinds of artifacts in the same location.
Because people have said they found a whole lot of stuff in Arnold's Park over by the, I guess it'd be where Minnie Washita's at. Over lots of arrowheads over where they are there.
This location, it was downtown center during the late prehistoric period. There are there's the Milford site. So there are lots of very huge late prehistoric Oneota period sites in this region. I think there's Oneota Park in Milford or Spencer, one of those two places, yeah. And that is the name of one of the late prehistoric cultures that occupied this region. You'll find a lot of stuff everywhere. But it's the time period. The Oneota stuff would look different from the Iowa Indian stuff. It would be a little bit older.
I'm new to all this idea of archaeology in Iowa. Tell me something about how Blood Run got its name.
Blood Run, there's a creek called Blood Run Creek that runs through and intersects with the Little Sioux, and then they both dump into the Missouri. So it's right at that location. Blood Run, the site was named after the creek. The creek was, as near as we can tell, the creek was named because there's a great deal of hematite, a red iron oxide mineral in the bottom of the creek, and when the light hits it right, the river looks red. So it was called Blood Run. As much as people would, little kids want it to be a big battle, but sorry, it's a red rock. Yeah.
Estimates on the population of Blood Run?
There have been estimates made. There's been really very little archaeological work done there, so we don't even have an estimate of how many houses. Once they've mapped it and can say, we've mapped 50 house structures, and if we estimate 15 people lived in each house, then they could begin to get an estimate of the population. But it's tricky because not all the houses were occupied at the same time. The site has been there, occupied probably for 1,000 years into the historic period, so we'd have to try and sort out different time periods and things too. But just the size of the site and the area covered and the number of features there, it was more than just a little village. It would have qualified like a city.
So with your years of experience, do you find Iowa one of the more interesting archaeological places?
Iowa is very fascinating. I've spent a lot of time working in North Dakota as well. And in North Dakota, the western part of the state has not much agriculture there. It's just pasture land. So you find teepee rings on the surface, standing earth conical lodges built out of driftwood and things like that. So I was flabbergasted to find that the stuff was still just lying on the surface, eagle trapping pits and things like that. There's the whole Midwest, the Great Plains areas fascinates me. I've also done work in Oklahoma and Kansas, the rock art in the Black Hills and in South Dakota. You're very near to, have you ever been to the Jeffers petroglyph site? Nip across the border into Minnesota, visit Pipestone, and then drive maybe another 30 miles down the road to the Jeffers petroglyph site. These are horizontal petroglyphs that were pecked into that Sioux quartzite, which must have been quite a job. Usually when you find petroglyphs, rock art, you find it in limestone or sandstone. That's easy to chip designs into, but this was in the, and it was on the ground surface rather than on a vertical surface. It's on a horizontal surface. And what they've discovered is they lay black tarps down, and that kills the lichen. And then when they lift it up and they scrape off the dead lichen, there's hundreds of figures on there. And the guy, the ranger there will take you out on a hike, and he has the greatest invention. This guy's a genius, whoever figured it out, has a truck mirror on a long pole and a wooden thing that will make a shade, because these things are really hard to see in full sunlight. But what he does is he'll put this thing down there and cast a shadow across it, and then hold the mirror to reflect light obliquely across it, and you can see all the figures just leap out. And it's really fascinating to know what's going on. You guys are within a day's trip to visit those things.
More of this archaeological work not done because it's not funded, or there aren't people interested in going out to do it?
Well, first of all, we're interested in preservation as much as anything else. So we don't just dig sites for the heck of it. We dig sites that are in danger. The first thing we do is identify sites that will be, you've heard of the environmental protection laws. There are also cultural resources protection laws. So things that have state and federal funding in them, highways, dams, things like that. They're required by law to have a cultural survey done first to identify things that might be destroyed by the construction. Many cities and towns also do this just out of a sense of responsibility. In Alexandria, in Virginia, and down in Florida, St. Augustine, they have city archaeologists that you can't even build a back porch without having an archaeologist come and check, because there's no place you can put a shovel in the ground that won't hit George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexandria, Virginia, just got everybody. So we will go and look at those. We'll evaluate those sites. We will record the information. Sometimes then they're just destroyed. If it's a very significant site, or if it has, it's deemed sacred by Native Americans, or there's human remains there, then we work with them to reroute around it and protect it. If it's a big significant site that they can't help but destroy, then we'll do a full-scale excavation and analysis of that material. But
More people studying this kind of stuff now, or?
there's quite a few, 25 or 30 people in our office. There are a number, most of the colleges have anthropology. We're anthropologists. Archaeology is a division of that. So I know Luther College does, Iowa State does. I'm sure most of the other colleges do. There are also some private companies, Bear Creek, Tallgrass, who just work on these contracts to fulfill the responsibilities of the state and federal agencies doing research. But then ethically, we try and get the information out. If we dig a site and don't tell anybody about it, we're looters. We've trashed it, and that information is lost. So ethically, then we have a requirement to preserve the information. So one of the things that you'll find at our office is archives with all of the field notes, all of the photographs, all of the maps and things from every archaeological excavation that we've done. Also, the artifacts are preserved in our repositories, so other people could come. Somebody say, I'm interested in studying the woodland period in northwestern Iowa. They can come to our office and access all that information and all those artifacts and do their research without ever having to go dig up anything. That information is already available.
I think part of the problem is it doesn't make the front page.
Not often. That's one of the reasons we like to get out stuff like this. I think everybody's interested in it. And that's why like books like this one. This one is aimed, a lot of times we can't tell people. If it's on private property, they don't want people tromping around there or something like that. So this is stuff, people are interested and want to know about Iowa. We also maintain a Facebook page, Iowa Archaeology. You can go and we try and get the information out about what we're finding and what fun stuff is coming up.
Yeah. Is there an organization for volunteers or not?
The Iowa Archaeological Society, the IAS. We do train people who are interested in working as volunteer in lab work or field work. We have a certification program. We also have a site recorder certification program. And this is one of the things that is really of value to us because the more eyes and ears out there on the landscape, the better. People know about things that they've found. Some people have been on this land for generations and they know where their stuff has been. And if they're willing to record that site, a lot of times people think that we come and, we're going to seize the property or seize the artifacts or something like that. And that's not what we're about. But we would be happy to get that dot on our map and say, we now know that there's another woodland site out here. Sometimes it could be even important to protecting that site later on. If somebody comes down the road and says, we're going to put a road through here, the landowner could say, there's an archaeological site there, and locate us. We also, people who are our eyes and ears, we get calls. Some very significant sites have been reported to us along the Raccoon River, flooding. IAS members call us up and say, there are storage pits exposed in the bank as a result of the flooding. And then we can get out there and we can do something about it. We can research it, we can stabilize it, whatever.
Time does it take between the time it's reported until somebody goes out there?
Oh, well, it depends on how many other things we have in our office going on at the time.
Talking months or years or?
Oh, not years, no, hopefully not. We try and get somebody out there as soon as we can, especially if it's sites being damaged or destroyed. We'll get somebody out there as fast as we can. Yeah.
So when the railroads came through originally, was there a system set up at that time for recording of any information?
Nope, we're just lucky. The GLO guys did record that stuff. Sometimes if you look at, it's really fun to dig through people's journals and diaries from that time period. Sometimes some guy in the railroad will, talk about picking up arrowheads while they're building the railroad or something. Like, wait, where was that? Yeah.
You asked about being a volunteer.
Right.
That Sanford Museum in Cherokee,
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
almost every summer he has a dig where
She does a field school where she trains people, and then we'll call out volunteers.
oh, it's a she.
Yeah. Megan Stroh-Meserole is the archaeologist at the
So
Sanford.
you see that announced in the paper every now and then. There'll be a little.
Yeah. Right now, and again, if you join the IAS, all that information, you get a quarterly newsletter and a yearly journal. And so announcements like that will appear, Sanford Museum, Field School, end of May, beginning of June this year. So, yeah.
We have monthly programs also.
Yeah, we have lots of local chapters. So there's like the Central Iowa chapter and the Northwest Iowa chapter. And we have 2 big statewide meetings a year, spring and fall.
All right, thank you guys. And the library does have this book that you can check out. So if you're looking for it, you can check out this book at the library or probably go to the website and purchase it there.
Yeah, it's through the Iowa Press, Iowa Press. So you have to contact them. But on our website, there are other publications, things that our offices put out. You can buy a download, electronic download of them for $5, or you could buy sometimes it's like, please take a paper copy as well as the electronic download. Some people prefer paper copies, some people prefer to read on screen because their houses are full like mine. But you know, and there's some that you can just read online for free. So
And if you need help with any of the maps on here to download them, if you don't have that, you can always come to the library and we can get you that information. So, all right, thank you, Shirley.
thanks a lot for coming out.